Okay, so the next thing we're going to talk about from the Romanesque era is painting. So we talked last time about sculpture and how there's kind of a revival in sculpture, right? Because we don't see much in the way of large-scale sculpture other than the standing Celtic crosses, right? Until the Romanesque, and then we start seeing large-scale sculpture again. Painting, on the other hand, does not need a revival. Painting continues throughout the early medieval period all the way up through into the Romanesque and Gothic. We have lots and lots of manuscripts being produced by monks and also some nuns. And there are illuminated manuscripts, which we've talked about before. Illuminated in this case meaning illustrated, right? So particularly we have the Cluniac monks, who are kind of really well known for their painting and for producing these kinds of works. So here is an example of that. This is the first page of the book of Matthew from the Codex Colbertinus, and it's produced at Moissac, where we looked at the cloisters and those sculptures in the cloisters there. So it's produced by an order of Cluniac monks, and you can see the level of detail. So we can see some similarities between other examples of illuminated manuscript pages that we've looked at before. We have some of this kind of interlacing pattern that we saw in earlier examples. So we have some of that, though it's not quite as all over like the carpet pages that we looked at from, say, the Hiberno-Saxon groups, right? But we have a little bit of this interlaced patterning. We have a little bit of zoomorphic patterning where we have kind of animal forms woven in. And then we have these very ornate beginning letters, which maybe makes us think of like the Book of Kells, which we looked at previously. So this is the L at the beginning of the book of Matthew, and we know it's the book of Matthew because his symbol is a man, right? So here he is. You can see that this has this sort of similarities to the sculpture we looked at. It's not naturalistic at all, right? So we have this kind of flattened out feet. We have these very long, strange fingers. We have folds in the clothing that are totally arbitrary. So we've lost that interest in perspective and also in realism, which continues throughout the Middle Ages, basically. We don't really see an interest in naturalism reappear until we encounter Giotto at the beginning of the Renaissance, actually. You can make an argument for Cimabue also, but anyway, take art history too. We'll talk all about those guys. All right, let's look at some other examples. This is also by the Cluniac order. So this is from the Corby Gospels, and this is the introductory page just to the book of Mark. We know that this is Mark. Why? Because he has a lion, right? So that creature that's all kind of twisted around and funny looking up at the top is a lion, which is Mark's symbol. Notice here again some similarities to the sculpture that we looked at in the last lecture. We have this kind of arbitrary, almost patterning in the folds of the cloth that have nothing to do with the body underneath. We have these kind of distorted proportions in the figure, little tiny feet, really big hands, his neck's at kind of an odd angle. So again, this kind of very unrealistic, otherworldly sort of style. Okay. The scribes at Moissac produced both of these examples that we just looked at, and they have a fairly discerning style. And you can tell these are by two different people, certainly, but similar color palette, similar kind of treatment of the body, of the forms within. And we also have these kind of architectural details, which is another thing that you see from this group. Okay, this is from Moralia in Job, which was produced in Citeaux, France. And this is the beginning of a passage that starts with the letter R. So we've seen really ornate letters before. This is where in the Romanesque we get a lot of this where the figures themselves are actually the letters. So not just like the letters are highly decorated, which is more like what we see here with that L. we start seeing this trend in Romanesque manuscript painting and illustration where the bodies of the figures are actually shaped into the letters. And you can still see this arbitrary kind of drapery, this elongated, totally unnaturalistic kind of body. And this is, when I was talking about the cloister capitals before and all the monsters and things that are depicted in them, you may recall that I said the monsters kind of symbolize chaos, and this idea of chaos without the Christian God, basically, is the symbolism. And so dragons like this, and I think this is actually a wyvern, but anyway, monsters of this kind symbolize this kind of struggle, okay, the spiritual struggle between chaos and between kind of religious virtue, okay. So this was made at the Abbey at Citeaux, and this is an illustrated version, an illuminated version of the Book of Job, which was originally created by St. Gregory. And it's completed right before Bernard takes over and decides that they're not going to do figural artwork anymore. But we have this St. George battling the dragon, which becomes a pretty common design motif in works from this time period. Okay, and then after Bernard, the Cistercian takes over. Manuscripts don't have full-page illustrations anymore for a while. Initial letters have to be non-figurative and kind of only decorated in one color. So this is kind of one of the last hurrahs before the style really changes. Okay. Painting isn't just limited to the pages of manuscripts, so that's a lot of the painting we see from the Romanesque period. There are also large-scale mural paintings being done in this time period. Not as ubiquitous as the sculptural reemergence that we're seeing in these large-scale cathedrals and churches, but we do have some frescoes kind of coming back. So this is a good example of that. This is Saint-Savin-sur-Guadeloupe in France in the late 11th century. Gartempe, not Guadeloupe, sorry. Totally different place, excuse me. This is a hall church. So a hall church is something we see in Germany a lot and a little bit in other areas, but it's kind of unusual in France actually. A hall church just means that the nave and aisles are the same height. Okay, so in most of the churches we've looked at, the nave ceiling is higher and the aisles are shorter. A hall church is everything is the same height. And this is really interesting to me because of the way this is painted. So one of the things that's positive from a painting perspective about a hall church is that there's more light, so you can see to paint better. These are not true, they're not fresco buono, they're just painted on the surface and on the stone surface, so they're not like, they're not fresco buono, they're kind of like fresco secco, except it's directly on the stone, not on a layer of plaster. And they painted these stone piers and columns to make them look like marble. So they're supposed to look like different kinds of exotic marble. What marble? I don't know. They don't really look like any real marble, but it's kind of it reminds me of first style Roman painting that we looked at in Pompeii, if you recall, where it's a kind of faux finish painting to make something look like something it isn't. So this is supposed to look like different exotic kinds of stone, clearly painted by people who had never seen these kinds of stone they were trying to imitate, but it's kind of charming. And we have not only the faux painting on the columns, but we also have, it's kind of hard to see in this image actually, but if you look up above, the whole barrel, it's a barrel vaulted ceiling, and the whole ceiling is also painted. So this is one of the examples, one of those panels from the ceiling, and this is an image of the Tower of Babel. So this is people trying to construct this Tower of Babel to reach the heavens. And then we have our Christ figure over here, who has the cruciform halo. Notice how his legs are positioned. It looks very much like that Romanesque sculpture that we looked at that was the column sculpture of Jerome or Isaiah. I think it's identified as either or. It's one of the Old Testament prophets, but his legs were crossed in that kind of weird arbitrary way, very elongated, very arbitrary patterning of the cloth. Okay, this is from Santa Maria de Mur, which is in Spain, and this is another example of large-scale painting from this time period. This is Christ in Majesty. So we've seen Christ in Majesty as a motif that's popular in the Romanesque in sculpture as well. And it carries over into painting also. So some similar elements to some of the sculptural examples we looked at. We have Christ. He has one hand in a symbol of blessing. He's holding the Bible in the other hand. He's seated, so he's enthroned. He has his cruciform halo. He has a full body mandorla around him. And then surrounding him are the symbols of the four Gospels, right? So we have the man for Matthew, we have the eagle for John, the ox for Luke, and the lion for Mark, all around him. There's also a really interesting kind of painted to look like it's three-dimensional meander or key pattern painted around the edge, which I think is really interesting. Okay, so very similar to what we are seeing in sculpture, particularly in France at this time, in the tympanum, the curved area over the doorways to Romanesque churches. Okay, let me see. Northern Spain has a lot more painting, large-scale painting than other parts of Europe during the Romanesque. So we see more examples of things like this where the apse is fully painted. This, by the way, has been completely removed and is now reconstructed in the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. Which is kind of weird. Okay, so let's see, what else are we going to talk about? This is one of my favorite figures from this time period. So this is a person named Hildegard of Bingen, and she was an abbess, and she becomes very famous within religious circles because not only was she this kind of really accomplished manuscript illustrator, she also saw visions. So she was a nun, and she becomes the abbess of a convent, in Dissoldenburg or somewhere, I think. I can't remember. Anyway, it's in Germany. In the Rhineland, in what's now Germany. And at an early age, she begins to have visions. Her parents place her in a nunnery. At 15, she becomes a nun. She's from this very wealthy family. But she has visions, and they're specific visions from God, and God is imparting knowledge to her. So she says that God tells her to reveal her visions. Bernard of Clairvaux declares that her visions were authentic in 1147. So he's like, she's the real deal. This is a miracle. We need to pay attention to what this woman tells us God is telling her. The Pope authorized her to publish her visions. So she gets signed off by the Pope himself saying, you need to publish these and draw these for us so that we can see what's happening. So she writes and illustrates all of these books. And the one this is from is called the Scivias, which is to know the ways of God, basically. And it's of her particular visions. So she also writes two scientific books, one called Physica, which is a study of the natural world. And she also writes Causes et Cures, which is causes and cures, and it's a medical encyclopedia. So she also does a lot of musical writing. She composes a lot of songs. She writes lots of lyrics, and she copies all of these down. 77 of the songs that she writes, so a lot of songs, 77 is quite a few, are published in a book called Symphonia. Okay, so there were other very smart, important nuns of the time. like Herod, who was also an abbess and wrote the book Hortus Deliciarum, which is the Garden of Delights, and it's basically a history of the world. But Hildegard is the most famous nun abbess from the Romanesque period. The book that this is originally from, Scivias, is lost in 1945, and other copies do exist, but they're not complete copies, it's thought. It contains a record of Hildegard's visions of the divine order of the cosmos and humankind's place in it. The visions came to her as a fiery light from heaven, is how she described them. And she's pictured here with a monk named Volmar, and he's kind of her best buddy. And so she gets these visions, and it feels like her, like holy fire in her face. And so she's kind of like, you know, almost in a trance. And she describes what she's seen, and he would sit there with her and write down all the visions for her so that she could then illustrate them and keep track of them after the fact. So this is kind of her author portrait that goes in Scivias like this. So she's kind of a fascinating figure. Okay, this is another illuminated manuscript from this period called the Gospels of Henry the Lion. Henry the Lion was the Duke of Saxony, and he was the Duke of Bavaria, so real important guy in Germany. He went on several crusades. The crusades were a big thing, as I've talked about already in this unit. He's very powerful. He builds the Brunswick Cathedral. He funded this whole city of Munich. He's like why Munich is a city in Germany. And these Gospels were commissioned by Henry the Lion for the Brunswick Cathedral in 1188 for its high altar. So he commissions this manuscript, which is the Gospels, specifically to be the kind of the altar Bible, the altar Gospels for this church, which he also commissioned. It's very heavily illustrated. It's quite beautiful. There's 24 full-page paintings, 50 total illuminations throughout. And they're very colorful like this. They have a kind of an expanded palette compared to other works of the time. This particular page is really interesting. So we have, you can see Christ with the angels on either side above him. He has this cruciform halo up there. And then what's happening below? We have the wedding and spiritual coronation of Henry the Lion and Matilda. So the word, and there are words written on here, and it says, the descendant of Charlemagne, to him alone would England trust Matilda. So Matilda's the daughter of King Henry the Second, I think, the King Henry the Second of England. And so it's a really big marriage. It's kind of unifying, you know, marriages are quite political at this time. But what's happening in this illustration is we have Christ and the angels and some of the saints above, and then you see these hands coming down into the bottom panel, crowning Henry and Matilda. That's supposed to be God himself coronating them. So it's interesting, we see some lineage here back to Charlemagne and the idea of the Holy Roman Empire and the idea of the Christian church and the Pope having this role in the coronation and the running of this empire. So this is sort of a callback to that lineage, okay? And he is a relative of Charlemagne. Okay. Oh, I had Henry II on my slide right there. I didn't even have to pull that out of my brain. There we go. Okay, so another example of painting from this time is the Bury Bible. And this is produced in 1135 at Bury. It's an abbey, basically. And Master Hugo is the painter. He was also a sculptor and a metal worker. He's really fascinating because he is not a monk. So he is a secular artist. He's not affiliated with the church at all. And this is when we start seeing in the Middle Ages, in the Romanesque period, this emergence of a class of professional artists and artisans who will go and do work for the church, for nobility, for independent merchants, whoever, that aren't affiliated with the church or specifically affiliated with the court of the ruling class, which is kind of interesting. So these kind of artists would travel all around Europe wherever they were being hired to work. So it's really interesting. It's a lovely illustration, a lot of really nice rich purple here, which is interesting. And we also, again, see the kind of elongated figures. Everything's kind of flattened. The patterning of the clothing is really arbitrary. So we have this, again, lack of naturalism. Everything's very stylized. Okay, this is the Edwin Salter. This is by a person who was named Edwin. He was a scribe. And this is his self-portrait of himself at work in a scriptorium. So he's an English monk, and he declares himself the Prince of Scribes. So he says he's like the best scribe. And one of the things that's interesting in his work is though it does kind of fit with this, you know, fairly flat, very stylized, not naturalistic kind of thing that we've seen throughout the Middle Ages, we start seeing a little bit of relationship between the drapery and the body, just kind of a hint that this might have something to do with the body underneath, just a tiny glimpse of that perhaps being a thing. But generally speaking, pretty much stylized like the rest of the work at the time. I like this image because he has his quill that he's writing with in one hand and his paintbrush in the other, so he probably didn't actually do those things at the same time. He probably wasn't actually ambidextrous, but it's basically just showing that he does the writing and the illustrating. So he's kind of, as he says, the Prince of Scribes. He can do all the things, which is pretty interesting. Okay, we will talk about Italy next and then the Bayeux Tapestry. All right.